I'm especially happy that George Metakides is with us. He's going to put the second parenthesis on this digital human and politics, also linking to what we heard previously. We know each other since more than 20 years on the old European Commission times. George has a mixed background from academia, where he was in mathematical logics, and he is still visiting an adjunct professor at universities such as Southampton, where he also is working with Wendy Hall, and he had contact with Tim Berners-Lee, also in the World Wide Web Consortium. But his second career is related with European research funding and running huge European research programs. So he was the director of the ESPRIT program and the ISD program. Each of these huge programs had several billions of euros, and George was the responsible director of these programs. And this is where we met 20 or more than 20 years ago. What I'm really happy also is that he is now the director or the president of the Digital Enlightenment Forum, which is a non-profit organization sitting also in Brussels, and they have very similar objectives to our digital humanism initiative. So really looking at the enlightenment and the principles of the European Enlightenment movement. I'm happy that you are with us, George, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hannes. Good afternoon, everybody. And first of all, on behalf of all of us, the whole team at Digital Enlightenment, we look forward to further and closer cooperation with digital humanism. We share goals, and I think we can join forces and see how many of them we can bring to fruition. So let me see if I can share the screen just momentarily. I want to talk about some policy directions for European digital sovereignty. Policy directions that are either in the planning stage or have already started being implemented, and their impact or their potential impact. But before that, I want to wish everybody a happy St. Corona Day, because it's May 14 today, and May 14 is the feast day of Saint Corona. Saint Corona was martyred around 170 AD, Marcus Aurelius' time, when she tried to console another crypto-Christian, Victor, who was being tortured to death. And for her kindness, she was tied on two bent palm trees and suffered the consequences when the palm trees were let go. So today is St. Corona Day, and I admire the prescience of the organizers to choose this date in honor of St. Corona. I want to talk a bit about sovereignty. What does it mean? Europe's current position and the Corona effect. Where do we go from here? What can happen at European level? What are the actual policy initiatives? And how can they take us, or at least try to take us, towards digital sovereignty and digital humanism? I think I can exit share, because I'm not going to use any further transparency. So a word of clarification about digital sovereignty. It does not mean autarky. It does not mean self-sufficiency. You don't have to have everything in digital infrastructures or digital business to achieve digital sovereignty. our digital enlightenment colleague, Paul Timmers, has thought and written extensively about that for those of you that want to read further about the subject. Roughly what it means is achieving a kind of strategic positioning in a balanced global interdependence where no contestant can damage you without damaging themselves. We have a lot of interdependencies in the digital ecosystem, as it was referred to in an earlier talk. US dependence, Apple, for example, on Chinese supplies. There's Chinese dependence, Huawei, for example, on American, Qualcomm, and other supplies. The major players in 5G are Chinese and European, and Europe is absent from the social media and cloud platforms, but is very present in industrial manufacturing platforms, in control systems, and others. So it's a bit, for those of you that are mathematically minded, a big complex graph with directed links that have weights on them. And the size of the nodes, the direction of the links, and the weights keep changing. And now comes the corona effect, which is accelerating these changes, discombobulates the graph, and potentially unlocks positions that looked safe, desirable for some, undesirable for others. What is the current, let's say, European situation? On February 18, a little before the pandemic showed its full force, there was published the European Strategy for Data and Artificial Intelligence. The analysis on which it was based was obviously pre-corona. But let me give you an example of what the analysis roughly showed. It showed that in some areas, Europe not only was absent, but there was a vicious cycle or negative spiral at work. For example, in what concerns social media and search engine platforms, the case is that there are a few companies, a small number of companies, the big tech that was referred to before, American and Chinese, that have oligopolistic access to European citizens' valuable data. The more data they have, the better they develop their algorithms, which in turn allows them to prepare better products and thus dig deeper into global markets, thus generating more data and access to more data that then feed into the cycle. So within this quest for digital sovereignty, there are all these vicious cycles or negative spirals at work that need to be faced. And the pandemic, the corona effect, accelerates all digitization. These vicious cycles are not an exception. It accelerates them also. For example, there was a comment earlier, I think it was by Moshe Vardi, about the power of the big tech companies and whatever the problems that this created in trying to reach an equilibrium or to negotiate fairly. Well, the big tech companies are emerging stronger from the pandemic, so far at least. This is not just because of the massive move online of all kinds of human activities, and it goes beyond their valuation that is in the 5 trillion neighborhood. But also Saint Corona is kind of, at least temporarily, blessing them with a halo. They're winning a tremendous public relations battle, because during the lockdown, politicians as well as citizens see connectivity as personified, if you allow the term, by the big tech platforms. And politicians congratulate them publicly in many cases. And citizens and much of the public are ready to put aside some of their concerns, like privacy, as was explained earlier in presentations, because of what is offered to them. As Hannes wrote in the introduction to this event today, they imagine what the world would be like without these platforms. And this generates a positive feeling. At the same time, I think it's only fair to add that some activities are undertaken not without profit, but which are beneficial. For example, Amazon is delivering masks, test sets, and is now offering logistics support for smaller companies so they can go online rather than going under. There is Google and Amazon helping states in the US to face the jobless claims, as they're inundated by jobless claims and others. And of course, there's the Google-Apple cooperation that was very thoroughly presented earlier, with all its pluses and minus, which a number of European member states are considering adopting or a variant thereof. So in this context, it's no surprise that there's an army of lobbyists that are unleashed in a charm offensive both in Washington and Brussels and elsewhere, arguing, guess what, that any kind of regulation, be that data regulation or AI regulation, would hinder the development of cutting-edge AI systems that would help save lives during the crisis. There's an element of truth always in that, but only an element. So, as a recent article put it a bit lyrically, there's a cold wind blowing over regulation. And this is not exactly what should not happen, because precisely at the time that these platforms are becoming critical to our very existence, our existence during the corona crisis and beyond, because much of the digitization is going to stay with us, as was also pointed out in an earlier talk. This is the time when we need safeguards to ensure that they serve the public interest, that they serve, in fact, digital humanism. And now I come to what can be done about it. For Europe to make a move at this time and not just step back waiting for the crisis to go away, would be to be delegated to the sidelines of the digital contest between the United States and China. Europe has to use all the leverage it can muster, and that is mostly at this time in the regulatory field, mostly but not only. And use what I think her name was Professor Anu Bradford from Columbia called the Brussels effect. Now, what is the Brussels effect? The Brussels effect is that if it succeeds to pass a regulation, a data regulation, like GDPR, with all let's say the questions about its efficacy, which I fully accept. Once this regulation is passed, why does it have any leverage? Because the big tech companies cannot ignore it. 1/3 of their business is in Europe. Neither can they significantly differentiate their products and practices in non-European markets, simply because of the nature, the global nature of their products. So they adjust. They have to follow the regulations more or less, and this will continue to be a struggle. But we saw this with all the regulations so far. There are some 120 countries that have adopted data protection laws that emanate from European regulation. The United States is not among them. So the first thing is for Europe to leverage the Brussels effect and leverage it now, not to let it be frozen because of the crisis. Is this enough? Certainly not. It helps slow the negative spiral, but not break it. And it doesn't provide the opportunity for Europe to go ahead aggressively in other areas. As someone put it a bit skeptically, referees do not win games. The regulation may even the field, it may set the rules, but refereeing does not win games. So where can the new data and AI strategy, the one I mentioned that was published on the 18th of February, in conjunction with the upcoming Horizon Europe research program, where can it take us? The data and AI strategy calls for the creation of a European data space, or rather in plural, European data spaces in crucial areas like manufacturing, like health, like energy, like agriculture, like the acquisition of digital skills and competences, so as to enable Europe-wide data sharing and trustworthy European cloud infrastructures. Let's just think of a possible example. This, by the way, these strategies were published 18th of February. They're now in public consultation with a deadline that was extended until about mid-June. Imagine, for example, a European health data space that could start with corona data and then extend into a Europe-wide health data space that can be used by health researchers and all related areas of research, as well as professional activity, which could also incidentally provide a basis for facing the next epidemic. I don't want to say the next pandemic, but a next epidemic will surely come. We seem to be getting about one a year for the last 10 years or so. Ditto for cloud providers. What is the presence of Europe today in the cloud provision? It's 1%, single digit. And at the same time, the United States Cloud Act provides that every United States cloud provider has to give all the data from any customers, wherever they are, to the United States government upon request. Combine this, and the need for a trustworthy European cloud is manifest. There are initiatives there. There's the Franco-German initiative called GEA, or Gaia, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, in Erasmian, ancient Greek. But if that doesn't fly, then something else will. This is part of the plan that is on the table. So the plan is on the table, and I would like to suggest that European sovereignty rides on its successful implementation, as does digital humanism. Because if we cannot have this trustworthy digital spaces, if we cannot have this trustworthy clouds, much of the rest becomes moot. And now let me end with something that's closer to a political statement. Up till now, I was talking about policies. And policy is different than politics. Now, my title said policies, but the title of the session said politics. So let me say something about politics, because, well, it's the elephant in the room, in most rooms anyway, that the corona effect, among other things, has shed light and exposed faults in the European structure. Not just one. The Karlsruhe court decision is just one instance. There are others. And of course, there is concern as to how this will be faced and whether they could put in doubt the future of the entire European project. Let me finish by telling you my reasons for being optimistic. What is happening now is comparable, okay, it's in my mind, to what happened at the late 19th century with mathematics. What happened in the late 19th century with mathematics? Well, the paradoxes came up. Cantor's paradox, Russell's paradox, and this caused mathematicians to say, look, I mean, we can't have paradoxes cropping up all the time. There must be something faulty or incomplete with the foundations. And then, you know, Frege and Cantor and Russell and Gödel, they went ahead and they created mathematical logic and the foundations of mathematics. And by the way, symbolic computing and all kinds of other things that followed. I think that these faults that the corona effect is making apparent today in Europe are a bit like the paradoxes. And I think that this focuses minds now on taking another look at the foundations and doing something substantial about them, especially in the Eurozone, and not just papering them over. And I'm confident that in this turning point, that decisions will be made, decisions will be accelerated again by the corona effect that will help Europe emerge stronger from this crisis, not much stronger, a little stronger, it's a gradual, it's a process, but emerge stronger and get closer to the ideals of digital enlightenment and digital humanism, with a little help from Saint Corona, perhaps. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Even if you use the word policies, you came back to politics. And at the end, it's about politics. And also summarizing your contribution, because it's about European politics and the worldwide politics. And Europe will need more than Saint Corona, probably. Europe will need more than Saint Corona to somehow position itself. Are there questions from the panelists, or from the not? Then I have, because what you were showing is in essence in your graph theoretical explanation that we have hubs, and you could describe it as the platform economics, which has this dynamics to become stronger with every participant. And this is something where Europe is not really taking part of it. So there might be some more, let's say, going to this mathematical contradictions or paradoxon in the economics. This is the paradoxon does not exist in that sense, because those, let's say, platform economies, they will become even more important in future if there is not a consistent answer. But Erich wants to say something.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the very important contribution, George. I think that's, I mean, politics or policies both have the power at least to change the world. So I think it is quite an important topic. And I generally think that this question of technology policy and especially IT policy is underrated in terms of the way that we give to it in terms of how much we discuss it and who is discussing it and how much it actually affects us. I think there is an imbalance, because as we see now, it heavily affects us, but the discussion only occasionally pops up when there is something very tangible. And my question would be, first of all, do you also see this and that this needs to change? And I want you to give us a recommendation for dealing with Brussels. Is that something that you believe that is high on the policy agenda in Brussels right now? Or is it the member states who are more active here? What's the relationship here? How do we find an entry to change this misbalance, if there is any?
Yes, first of all, I do agree that policy is important, can change the ecosystem, and is for many people just a black box. They don't understand, what it is or how it comes about. In that respect, there's a deficit, and I think it's incumbent on all of us, and of course, those responsible in Brussels, to make sure that, for example, young researchers, academic researchers, understand better how the regulatory process works, and in fact contribute to it, rather than thinking that it's something that strange bureaucrats invent. Furthermore, especially in the digital ecosystem context, it is imperative that the new policies on data spaces and clouds and AI regulation go hand in hand with research financing instruments like the new framework program, not to remain separate from it. As to what they can improve upon, I asked this question to Edward at the beginning, because he said that much of regulation starts with a wrong premise, that somehow, IT is created top down, and while it happens in more complex, mutative fashion. I agree with him on that. But on the other hand, we have to see how to regulate an ecosystem without trying to regulate individual small parts of it, because it's a complex system. As a complex system, it cannot be regulated by regulating particular pieces, because the system is not the behavior of the system is that of a complex system. If you take the case of GDPR, that is somehow the most known regulation, there are many that say, well, is it efficient? Has it done something? And it reminds me of, I was at Cornell University in the 60s, and I did participate in a sit-in at the time. It was the Vietnam War, and some people asked, not me, but the person next to me, whether they realized the futility of sit-ins, and the answer was, do you realize the futility of doing nothing? So the regulation at European level is a learning process, and I think that more people, especially young researchers, should get involved in it. Now, the question about whether it should be left to the member states or whether it should be done at European level, for me the answer is simple. It can only be done at European level. None of these things we're talking about makes any sense to be done at national level. The fact that the corona response was at national level, this is This is natural for many reasons. I think speakers addressed that before. In addition to the fact that there is no common health policy that is in the remit of the European Union. For the European digital landscape, for European digital sovereignty, the initiatives have to be at European level.
Is it sufficient to have only regulatory frameworks? I think it's also important what you mentioned afterwards, that we also have to invest in research and innovation, because if you look just at the number of publications in AI, Europe is very well positioned there. So I think we really should look to transform those things to also to innovation and the business landscape. But Edward is saying something, and you have to unmute your phone, your mic.
Yes, also thanks. Paul Timmers asked the question.
George, thanks for your very insightful comments. You're right that it's a complex system, but one of the interesting things that you can do is, if you understand the feedback loops that are present, then it's possible to regulate feedback loops at any point in the loop. Okay. I mean, control theorists know how to do that. So to give a concrete example about privacy, it may be more effective to make, to have high school kids required to read Shoshana Zuboff. That may be more effective than GDPR, okay? Because it's part of the feedback loop, and one of the interventions you can do besides, regulating the software producers is also educating the public. So there's opportunities to intervene at any point in a feedback loop in order to change the dynamics of that loop.
Edward, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, if you made kids read the GDPR, that would drive them off the subject for life, and justifiably so. That doesn't mean that GDPR is useless, though. It may be unreadable. That's a different issue.
They are excellent presenters on the GDPR, so we could invite them. There was a question by Paul Timmer, or was it? I have not seen it.
His hand was up very briefly, so I don't know.
Paul, it's yours. You can speak now.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
George, that next frontier, AI, that's already upon us. In the context or against the backdrop of the corona crisis, but also the lessons learned from GDPR, because Europe may have been very good in the GDPR and becoming perhaps the referee in this area, but not the player, because perhaps, as Hannes also suggested, we did not really combine regulation with technology development and investment, so that Europe also plays a very important role in, for example, privacy enhancing technologies. AI may be different. And Europe is working actively on AI and ethics, and perhaps is coming with regulatory measures. But then the question raises itself, should that be a European approach or should that be a global approach? But if we take an open global approach post-corona, well, many companies will be financially weak. We know that there will be a lot of capital around to do takeovers in Europe, and we, again, may lose it if we play the game as open as we have done perhaps also in the research programs at the time around the year 2000 and until 2010 or perhaps even 2015 in Europe, very open programs. So should we be rather European and inward oriented, or can we take the risk and be open and global?
For some of the framework regulatory issues, I think by necessity it will go global. I mean, look at GDPR and some of the related regulations. They have become global by default, simply because many parts of the world did not want what they consider as kind of American techno-libertarianism or Chinese techno-authoritarianism. And the European approach was adopted broadly by countries from Australia to South Africa to India and so on. So that part can be global in its approach, but not the operational part where the development of the regulatory framework goes hand in hand with the research and the investment and the innovation. I think there, by necessity, there will have to be some tightening, or else the players that are needed to play and make it a success will not be either motivated or feel safe enough to do so.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I don't see any further questions. This is, I think, also due to the long afternoon, evening, or morning, not to your explanations, George. Thank you.